So Vladimir sent his delegates. I'll start a little. So Saint Prince Vladimir rejected Islam. And then, what's next? Well, there was a Jewish colony in what is now the Crimea, and he sent a delegation there. I can't remember what they didn't quite like about that particular culture, but again, imagine if Vladimir had made Russia a Jewish nation. Again, European and world history would be quite different. Then he sent a delegation even further west to visit the Roman Catholics, but you know, this is literally the Dark Ages in the West. It's like visiting the West at their lowest point, intellectually, culturally, and all the rest. They were not impressed. They said their ceremonies left something to be desired. They were rather boring. And then the delegation returned from Byzantium, from Constantinople, and they were ecstatic. They said, this is it. We went to worship among them, and we didn't know whether we were in heaven or on earth. It was so beautiful. Of course, it was all in Greek, but somehow that didn't matter. The glory, the beauty, worshiping in the Church of Hagia Sophia was an overwhelming spiritual experience. And so Vladimir said, okay, ask the Byzantine emperor to send us teachers. Well, they were already there in Macedonia, where they'd been hanging out for about 100 years. And so the teachers and the books already in Slavonic that had been preserved since the time of Rostislav entered Ukraine and Russia, and the people learned to read and write. And within a few generations, within 2 or 3, they had their own style architecture. You can study this in world history, of course, how Russian Balkan architecture evolved almost immediately into its own style, its own unique, with its own unique imagery and its own unique styles. And this flourished for another 200 years. Even their own musical tradition began evolving. And then came the Tatars. In the 1200s, Genghis and Kublai Khan set off in all directions in order to pretty much put an end to civilization. I don't know if this was their conscious mission, but it is what they did. They came to cities and they trashed them, they burnt everything down, and they slaughtered the populations. Now, every time we hear about such tragedies in world history, we wonder, well, first of all, we know that the people who wrote the story were the people in the cities, because only the people in the cities could write. We don't have Genghis Khan's memoirs, why I burnt Baghdad down the first time. We don't know. He didn't tell us. But I've been studying this struggle between rural and urban peoples for the last 20 years. You see, it's something that's still going on. I think it's one of the most significant developments of the 20th century, although Time and Newsweek failed to mention it somehow when the millennium turned. And what I mean by that is that human beings have been rural people, country people, not necessarily nomads, not necessarily tribal in that sense, but living off the land, either as hunting-gathering species or an agricultural species that pretty much ran their own little farms, lived in small villages, or on scattered rural estates. And we've been that kind of creature since Adam and Eve. For tens of thousands of years, human beings have been rural. Only in the late 20th century have we become an urban society, an urban species. It's actually about 1950 in the United States. I think it's the 1950 census when, for the first time, statistically, a majority of Americans were living in a city instead of a small village or on a farm. It's a relatively new transition. Even more important, by 1980, for the first time in human history, a majority of people on the planet were living in a city and not in a farm or in a rural area. So for the first time, it's only 50 years or less. Most people today are living in a city when their ancestors, not just in recent past, but for thousands of years in the past, were rural. We haven't quite learned how to do this well yet, because cities aren't necessarily a happy, healthy place to be. We all have this sense that it's too congested and there's too many others around here and it's not safe, and right? So, but city life is where it is, and city life has come to dominate the planet, and people in the city certainly have the political power, because when it's up to majority vote, there are always more voters in town than there are in the countryside. But this is a very new development. Until in the time of Genghis Khan, in the time of the Tatars, there were far more people riding horseback across the Asian plains than there were people settled in Kiev or Moscow or Paris or Rome. Most people were rural. Most people were tribal. Most people were living in small villages or on farms, and they were close to the earth. And only in the late 20th century has that balance shifted. You can write world history, I believe, in terms of the struggle between the rural people and the city folk. Now, it's the city folk who write the histories, because they, by definition, have the alphabets and the books and the libraries. Genghis Khan comes to town, and he burns the library down. He's violently opposed to this newfangled city life, which has only been going on for about 5,000 years, while human beings have been around for a couple 100,000. So it's city life that's something new, and for some reason, these folks, these so-called barbarians, are violently against it. Now, like I said, we can't psychologically analyze their behavior. But we do know they were violently against cities, because every time they found one, they trashed the place. If you go back, however, to the very first cities, the most ancient cities in the world, they're in modern-day Iraq, but they're not inhabited anymore. Archaeologists have found the most ancient cities, and they're out in desolate wilderness, sand-covered deserts. Did the first cities arise in 100-degree heat out in the deserts? No. Those deserts were, when those cities first began, fertile farmland, productive wheat fields. As far as the eye could see, it was out of the surplus of that agricultural abundance that city life arose. Well, then how come it's all desert now? And the answer is, the deserts are man-made. Human beings farmed that land for thousands of years without doing anything to replenish it. And eventually that land became simply exhausted, and those cities were abandoned. Because you see, cities always make unreasonable demands on their ecosystems. That's the lesson of the first cities. Now, I can't read, as I say, Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun's mind, and we don't have any diaries to prove this. But as I reflect on the history of human beings and the struggle between the barbarians, so-called, the nomadic tribal peoples on one hand, and people who lived in cities on the other, it seems to me that the nomads are kind of sitting there on the hillside overlooking the town and saying, nothing good will come of this. This is not a good idea. These cities are like open sores on the surface of the planet, and we should stamp them out before it gets out of hand. In other words, and because in fact they're right, the cities do get out of hand. They do exploit the environment, they do destroy the ecosystem, and eventually they turn fertile wheat fields into deserts. What I'm proposing, you see, informally, is that Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun, they were simply the ancient predecessors of modern Greenpeace activists. They were against this whole experience, or this whole experiment in city life, because they said to each other, this will lead to no good. In any case, for whatever reason, Genghis and Attila come crashing into Kiev, and they burn the place down. They slaughter thousands of people, and the rest they take off as slaves. And then they say to the survivors, now, don't rebel and pay your taxes. The Eastern pattern. And the capital is far away in Asia, and for 200 years the Slavic people don't rebel because they don't have the strength to rebel. And they pay their taxes, burdensome as they were. 200 years, but they gradually build their strength. They have more babies, and they do it as a military necessity. Now think of it, if those people had been Muslim, like the Tatars, First of all, they probably wouldn't have been burned down. And secondly, they simply would have been grafted onto the Mongol Empire, and Mongolia would extend from China to Austria today. So Vladimir's choice of Christianity is a critical point in world history, because it was as Christians that they said, we can't continue to pay these crippling taxes to the Islamic overlord in Ulaanbaatar. We just can't send taxes anymore to Sarai. We are going to have to do something about this because it's crippling us, it's killing us, it's crushing us. So little by little, starting actually from Moscow in the north, the Slavic peoples begin the gradual liberation of their homeland from the Tatar overmasters. It's only because of this that the Slavs wind up in Asia. If the Tatars hadn't come in from the east, there wouldn't have been much of incentive for them to push them back over the Urals into Asia. But they had no choice. They couldn't just fight the Tatars and get them to the other side of the mountains and say, okay, let's make peace, time out. Because the Tatars would be right back in their backyard as soon as they turned their backs. They had to keep going. Once they began their revolt against the Tatars, they wound up in Asia. And once in Asia, they had to push the Tatars all the way back to Mongolia. And once they're in Mongolia, it's a hop and a skip and a jump to the Pacific Ocean. In 400 years, from the 1200s, when the Tatars defeated the Slavs, to the 1600s, it's not that long, or even shorter, from the middle of the 1400s, 1440s, when the Slavs finally begin to fight the Tatars and win, it's only 240 years till they get to the Pacific Ocean. It's a rather remarkable expansion of the Russian state to go from Europe to the Pacific in 250 years. This expansion happened actually as a two-pronged wave. Just like in the American West, hundreds of years later, Russia had the Wild East. To some extent, it still does have the Wild East. Hasn't been mapped, hasn't been tamed, hasn't been settled, hasn't been colonized. But back then, it was even more of a wilderness and more unknown and more savage and more difficult because it's much colder than our Wild West was. The people who go over the mountains and venture into this vast wilderness of Siberia, the first ones are exactly the same kind of people who ventured into our wilderness after Lewis and Clark. Frontiersmen. There's a lot of land out there. Let's go homestead. There's a lot of rivers out there. Let's go fishing. There's a lot of game out there. Let's go hunting. There's a lot of fur out there. Let's go trapping. In Canada, it was the French colonists, bachelors mostly, who ventured into the wilderness, built their log cabins, set up their trap lines, put out their fishing nets, and if they needed anything local, traded with the local natives to get what they wanted. And usually if they married anybody, they married one of the local native women. There's a whole classification in Canada of people called Métis. And the Métis are the descendants of French-Canadian trappers who intermarried with the various Indian tribes there. The same thing happened in Siberia. These men in Russian called promyshleniki. Promyshlenie is commerce. Well, there's really not. People who engage in trade. But these are not merchants with white starched shirts who have a cash register and deal with people over a counter. These are guys who hunt, fish, trap, and when they need other things, they trade with the local native people to get what they want. And the native people come to them to get what they want. So I've got, a nice musket here. Not a very good one. Of course, we're talking 1600s. It takes 20 minutes to reload it. It doesn't always work. You have to keep your powder dry. You have to ram everything down. But anyway, it's better than a bow and arrow. So the Indians will give you 100 pelts for this rifle and enough buckshot to kill 20 deer. They're happy, you're happy. It's that kind of trade. These guys run those kind of trading posts in the early 1700s, and they expand gradually across Siberia along the Chinese border. The trouble with Siberia, unlike the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, which flow south and are ice-free, is that in Siberia, the rivers flow north and are frozen most of the year. Now, frozen isn't bad because you can walk on water that way. But it was actually more efficient to move eastward across Siberia, traveling along the Arctic coastline. That was faster. Of course, you had to wait for summer. But we know that the first Promyślenniki to enter the Bering Sea actually came from the north, not from the south. In 1648, a group of entrepreneurs, frontiersmen of this sort, the Davy Crockett Daniel Boones of the Wild East, made a voyage from the Arctic Ocean into the Pacific. The leader of this group was named Simeon Brezhnev, and the date was 1648. Now, what does that mean? It means probably by 1649, there were Russians in America. If it only took them 200 years to get from Finland to Chukotka, it didn't take them more than another year to make the next leap across. We read in our history books that Alaska was discovered in 1741 by Vitus Bering. But I'm thinking that that's probably it actually happened 100 years earlier. And that there were Russians, frontiersmen, moving across Siberia, not knowing where they were going. It had never been explored before, but they got to the end of Russia and sailed around into the Bering Sea. And they founded a trading post that's still there, Anadyr, Anadyr, Anadyr. And there's a Gulf of Anadyr that's labeled as such on the maps of the world, and yet no one in Europe knew it. They didn't report back to the Tsar, by the way, we've made it to America. Now, why not? How come no one in Europe knew about Brezhnev's voyage in 1648, and in 1742 they were still scratching their heads wondering whether North America and Asia were connected or not? Well, the answer is simple. Remember the rule? To be a citizen of the empire, pay your taxes and don't rebel? Yeah, but what the IRS doesn't know won't hurt you. If you're busy trading with Alaskan natives and bringing in furs and selling them to the Chinese, and you're 12 time zones away from the tax collector, why tell them? It's perfectly understandable why these guys didn't send a telegram or write a letter to the Tsar saying, by the way, we've now sailed between Asia and North America. They didn't bother to report it. What they don't know won't hurt you. So in 1728, the Tsar says to Vitus Bering, I want you to go out there and sail along the coast until you come to North America. You see, geography experts in Europe had calculated that Asia and North America should be connected by land. And if you followed the coast of one, you would wind up in the other. So in 1728, Bering was sent out there precisely to go along the coast, and he did. And he went right up the Russian coastline and wound up in the Arctic Ocean. And much to everyone's surprise, he turned around and went back and reported to the European geographers, it's water. You can't follow the land and get there. It's water. This surprised everyone. Actually, if the water were 200 feet shallower, it would be land. The Bering Sea is only 200 feet deep. It's a very shallow sea. So they were just off, not in their calculations, but in their appreciation of how much water there was in the Pacific Ocean. But this, now, according to Russian propaganda then and now, in 1742, 14 years later, the Tsar said to Vitus Bering, do it again. We find your report rather perplexing, and we're not quite sure you got it right. So go back and do it again. This is what they told everybody. It's still what we say in our history books. It's clearly not true. And the evidence for this is that on his second voyage, and there were two ships, the St. Peter and the St. Paul. Remember, we named everything after feast days. There's the two ships, the Peter and the Paul, and the St. Peter is commanded by Bering, and the St. Paul by Alexei Chirikov. And they both set off from Okhotsk on the Pacific Ocean. They sailed over to the Kamchatka Peninsula and stopped, because that's as far as they could get. And they founded the town of Petropavlovsk. You see, this is true to the same pattern. Peter and Paul, Petropavlovsk, Kamchatsky. They spent the winter there, and then the next spring, as soon as the ice broke, they sailed straight east. They never entered the Bering Sea. They sighted land as far east as they could go. If you know the map of Alaska, it's that straight line that goes from the North Pole down to Mount St. Elias, because that's what they saw from sea. It's 18,000 feet tall, and it's the tallest mountain in the world that comes from sea level directly up. There's no mountain like this. Even if you went to the foothills of Mount Everest or Mount McKinley in our state, you're a couple miles high before you ever get to the base of the mountain. So the first 5,000 or 10,000 feet is already underneath you, and the mountain doesn't look that big. Mount St. Elias is spectacular. It rises almost directly from the sea, 18,000 feet up in front of you. And they saw that peak and they said, we hereby draw a line from the peak of that mountain to the North Pole, and everything behind us is now under Russian control. You see why the Tsar didn't tell anybody in Europe what they were really up to. Oh, we're going back to the Bering Sea just to reconnoiter a second time. No, they weren't. They didn't even go into the Bering Sea. They went directly east, and they had plaques about so big. We have one of them in our diocesan museum in Anchorage. It reads in Russian, "This land is under Russian protection." And there were many of these, but we've only been able to find one. Bering landed, put his plaque in the ground. Chirikov landed one day earlier, way down south along the Canadian border, which is why we have that part of Alaska that kind of meanders along the Canadian border, because Chirikov landed down there one day earlier than Bering. And Chirikov turned around because it was getting late and went back to Russia, got to Petropavlovsk, waiting for Bering. Bering, in the meantime, got scurvy. His crew got sick. Half of them died. Then they shipwrecked on another island and had to spend the winter there. So I've often wondered, how come Bering, who died on the voyage, never got home, got to Alaska second, gets all the credit, and Alexei Chirikov, who got there first and got home in one piece, you never hear about him. And I suspect it's because Americans couldn't pronounce Chirikov. Besides, Slavs couldn't have done that. You need a Dane in the service of the Russian Navy to pull this off. You need somebody from the western side of the line, because people on the eastern side of the line are bumpkins. They don't know. And in fact, it's not true. But we feed into this sort of cultural prejudice that people from Eastern Europe aren't quite as smart as the people on the West. And sometimes even Eastern Europeans believe it. But it's simply not so. Chirikov got there first. Chirikov got home in one piece. Bering got there second and died. But that he's the only one you hear about. In any case, they came back, these guys, these permishleniki, aboard these boats, with sea otter pelts. And no one had ever seen sea otters before. Sea otters have the densest fur of any mammal in the world. Almost 1 million hairs per square inch. That dense. And they're called sea otters for a reason. They've seldom come ashore. The fur is so dense that it's virtually waterproof as well as warm, and it's softer than mink. Now put all these things together: warm, waterproof, and soft. It was the luxury item of its time, and the Chinese were paying top ruble for this. It wasn't for the Russians. The Russians could get their own furs. It was the Chinese, who didn't have any forests, who were paying for the furs. And they offered a year's pay per pelt. Now do the math. A year's pay per pelt. You're a young man, 18, 20 years old, and if you get to Alaska and can come home with a couple dozen pelts, you're set for life. And so this set off a fur rush to Alaska that brought hundreds and eventually thousands of people back and forth, traveling in small skin boats to trade for those pelts and make a killing, so to speak, on the Chinese market. So this is how the Russians got to Alaska. When the priests came, they came later, their policy was, well, let's invent an alphabet for these people. Let's teach the children to read and write in their own language. Let's translate the Bible into the local native languages, Aleut, Tlingit, Yupik Eskimo, and so forth. And that's what they did. Now, people who read about this in our history books say, oh, those Russian priests, they were certainly culturally sensitive. They were geniuses. They were linguistic giants. They were. But they weren't inventing this idea. That's why I started with Alexander the Great. It was natural to them. That's what you do. You meet people who don't read and write, you invent an alphabet for them. You translate the Bible into their language. You conduct church services in their language. That's what you do when you meet people like they met in Alaska. And so for the Russian period of Alaska's history, which is 1742 when Bering's shipwrecked, and the fur rush began. Until 1867, that was the policy. And what did this produce in Alaska? In the last 50 years of Russian rule, it produced an intelligentsia comprised primarily of native Alaskans. Gentlemen who could, when they needed to, put on a frock coat and drink tea with the best of them and discuss Russian poetry. And at the same time, take that off, put on their native Alaskan hunting gear, get into a kayak, and paddle along the coastline for hundreds of miles. Most of Alaska was in fact mapped by men who had studied map-making cartography in St. Petersburg and then returned and got into their kayaks and paddled along the coast. The last part of the world's atlas to be completed was the Arctic coastline of Alaska. But those maps were drawn. That section of the atlas was completed by native Alaskans who were graduates of the Kronstadt Naval Academy. Now, when I discovered this in 1979 and began writing about how native Alaskans had, in one generation, finished the equivalent of elementary and high school, and in the next generation were sending their kids to college in Siberia or even to Europe, people said, "You're making that up." No one wanted to believe that our Orthodox schools could produce such a rich intellectual harvest in 50 years. They wanted to believe instead that the Promyshleniki were more like American Rambos, who came into the Aleutian Islands with their guns blazing and just slaughtered the natives right and left, sort of like a Little Bighorn in reverse. Indian massacres, because we had them in our history, it was assumed that the Russians did the same thing, but the histories are very different. Americans settled the West with Conestoga wagons traveling across the prairie. You know, little house on the, right? There's Charles Ingalls and all the daughters and his wife, and they build a sod cabin and they farm it. But it's a man with his wife and kids coming across and settling. The Russians didn't have wives and kids in wagons. They had Jeremiah Johnson. They had Grizzly Adams. They had these bachelors who went into the wilderness. And if they married, it was exactly like that Robert Redford movie, Jeremiah Johnson, where when he finally married, it was to the Indian girl. The chief insisted. He didn't even want to take a wife, but he really had no choice. That's how it was. And that was the pattern in Canada, and that was the pattern in Russia. There's this, I think, this misconception, you see, that all colonial powers advanced like the United States or like the English. The English and the Americans very seldom intermarried with local women. They brought their own, or they sent home to get a bride. But that wasn't true of the French. The French across Canada intermarried with native tribes. It wasn't true of the Russians. The Russians across Siberia intermarried with native tribes. It wasn't true of the Spanish. Most of Mexico is of mixed parentage, of Spanish and Aztec or Mayan cultures. These other cultures regularly intermarried, but not the English. The English were a bit standoffish about that. I can't say that it was because it was purely racist, but there has to be that factor. In any case, the pattern is different. You didn't want to kill off the natives in Alaska. If you did that, there'd be no one to get the furs for you. The sea otters are called sea otters because they stay in the sea. You need to be adept at kayaking to catch sea otters. If you want sea otters, you need Aleuts. You need native hunters to go out there. Then you trade for them. And even when the company became rather exploitative and oppressive, it wasn't their policy to kill the Aleuts because they would have been out of business instantly. They needed those people. Plus, in Russian America, there were never more than 800 people from Siberia. Some of them were native Siberians. Some of them were of mixed European and Siberian background. Some of them were actually Europeans who had ventured all the way across Siberia, but actually very few. Most of them were either native or of mixed heritage, and they came to Alaska mostly to trade. If they had guns, I've already described them. They weren't much of a military advantage. You're outnumbered, there's 6 of you and 300 of them. So you're outnumbered 50 to 1. You might be able to come into a village with your musket and fire it once. After that, you look like a porcupine. Because being outnumbered 50 to 1 meant you got off your shot, and before you could reload, you were goner. What would be the advantage to that? It doesn't make sense, and yet the American histories of Alaska basically say it was a military invasion and the Aleuts were slaughtered. They weren't slaughtered, but their population declined. It declined not so much because they were killed off, but because in the censuses they moved from being native to being classified as Creole, people of mixed parentage. So the native population went down, and the Creole population went from 0 to many thousands. Change of tape.